All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first of 4 sessions of Returning to School with Equity in Mind. We are delighted to have so many of you joining us today. My name is Kimberly Dickerson. I am a postdoctoral researcher with Youth-Nex and the Equity Center, the two centers at UVA who are sponsoring this wonderful event. Youth-Nex aims to expand and apply the science of positive youth development to address social and societal challenges, and the Equity Center works to address racial and socioeconomic inequities in university communities. We invite you to visit both centers' websites, follow them on social media, or sign up for the Youth-Nex newsletter to learn more about the ongoing work. I'd also like to introduce Leslie Boreen, who is the Assistant Director of Communications at Youth-Nex, and she will be helping to moderate today's session. Before I introduce today's speakers, we have a few housekeeping notes. As a webinar participant, you are automatically muted. However, you can ask questions throughout the session using the Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And during the designated Q&A time, you can also raise your hand with that option, and we will unmute you so you can speak directly with the presenter. Next, we are recording this presentation, and it will be available online later on our website. The slides from today's presentation will also be available after the session on the website. Finally, if you're interested in receiving professional development credit for attending, you can contact Youth-Nex for documentation. I would like to introduce today's speaker, Emily Warren, who will be presenting on trauma-responsible teaching practices. Emily Warren is the Director of Prevention for Region 10 CSB in Charlottesville, Virginia, and has an MED in Counselor Education from the University of Virginia. She has previously worked as an outpatient counselor and crisis stabilization clinician. Emily is the chair of the Suicide Prevention Awareness Resource Council, which provides free training and suicide prevention resources for individuals in the Central Virginia area. She currently supervises a team of school-based student assistance prevention specialists, parenting support programs, and trainings, including mental health first aid and applied suicide intervention skills training. Emily is a master trainer for ACE Interface, the Community Resilience Initiative's Trauma-Informed Certification course, and Trauma Supportive Certification course. And she has trained over 5,000 individuals in trauma over the last 2 years. So welcome, Emily.
Thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to be here today. So thank you for UVA and Youth-Nex and the Equity Center for hosting this. I see a lot of names that I recognize on the call, so I'm glad to see you all here. I know that for many people, this might be your month off. So I'm really grateful that you took the time to join us here today. I also want to recognize, I know there are some people on this call who are maybe not from the Charlottesville, Albemarle area. Some of my stories might be about Charlottesville, Albemarle, but they're certainly applicable across the state. But if you live locally, you will maybe recognize some pictures that I'll use in this presentation. So before we kind of get into the material, I just want to acknowledge that this year is a complete year of unknowns. We have no idea what the academic school year is actually going to look like. I know that schools are starting to release their plans for maybe a hybrid, a few days a week in the building, a few days a week out of the building learning. But we know that as the pandemic continues and the rates continue to rise, there's a chance that we might move to all online. And we also know there's a push right now from the federal government to have all in person. So I just want to recognize the stress that this must be causing for all school staff, not just teachers, but administrators, school counselors, janitor staff, custodial staff, anyone who works in interfaces with that great number of students every single day. Some of those stressors are deeply personal. We are worried about our own health and safety, the safety of our families if I'm exposing myself to hundreds or thousands of students every day. If you are someone who has children, how are you going to manage your own childcare if it doesn't match up with your school's schedule? And I don't know a single school staff that doesn't deeply care about doing their job well and making sure that their students receive the best academic success they can have and care about their students' health and well-being as well. So I know teachers and school staff are deeply concerned about how this year is going to look for students. I think sometimes the way it's portrayed in the media, they might be kind of pitting teachers against parents. And I think we all have a shared common care for our students and their academic success and their health and well-being. So I just want to acknowledge that, because I think that underlies how you're going to do your job over the next year. And you can't do your job without focusing on yourself. And I know that this equity series is going to talk a little bit more about staff self-care in a later session, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I just want to acknowledge there's a crisis responder called Dr. Scott Poland who did a presentation recently, and he's known for responding to things like school shootings. He responded after Parkland. He was heavily involved in Katrina response. He's used to going to schools after extremely traumatic events. And what he has found is some of the common beliefs and feelings from staff after these events is that they don't feel as supported coming back to school. They feel like they're asked to come back before they're fully prepared. And that's a problem. And I think a lot of people are feeling that right now. We have a lot of unknowns, and we need to start thinking about what we can control and what we can't control. And you guys have probably seen, I saw this graphic shared all over social media at the beginning of the pandemic, but the importance of kind of limiting technology if that is becoming overwhelming and stressful for you, and really getting the support from your colleagues and supervisor that you need, and using other resources. I know for therapists, there's great online communities where people are sharing what works and what doesn't work. I imagine teachers have very similar online communities, and you are the experts. Share your successes and share the things that you're struggling with, and see what feedback you can get, and really prioritize what you love to teach. We'll talk about this later, but this year is going to look different for what our expectations for academic success are. So I want to do a really basic overview before I get into the strategies, because I think you have to have some foundational knowledge of what the impact is on the brain, experiencing the kind of traumatic stress that comes with something like a pandemic. So this is going to be the briefest of overviews, because I know some people have heard this message before, but really, when we start with brain development, our brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out. And it really starts with this red part of the brain here. And this is our brain stem, or what we call our survival brain. This is where fight, flight, and freeze live. And this is something we are born with. And it gets stronger and stronger over time, especially if we live in a high stress environment where we are constantly predicting threat. And then the next part of our brain that develops is this limbic system, our yellow brain. And this is where our big emotions live. This is anger, fear, happiness. It's our good emotions too. And this can be a really powerful center in our brain. It's part of what will release all those good hormones that we want, like oxytocin. And the last part of our brain to develop is our executive functioning brain. This is our green brain, our learning brain. This is the only part of our brain that we can really learn in. And so as educators, we want to keep people safe and connected so they can learn. We want and expect our students to be in their green brains when they come into the building or log on to Zoom. But the reality is, right now, a lot of our students are not in their executive functioning brain. They are experiencing big emotions. And for some, they may be in their survival brains. They might live in an unsafe household, or are extremely worried about illness, either with themselves or a family member or a neighbor. So we know that they might be in their downstairs brain. And when you're in your survival brain or your emotional brain, it is hard to communicate with that executive functioning brain. And we like to introduce this idea of brain states, where each kind of section of the brain has one job to do. When you're in your executive functioning brain, you can learn. When you're in that emotion brain, what you really need is connection. When you are feeling those big emotions, what you need is to be validated in that moment and feel heard and understood. And when you are in your survival brain, what you need is safety. And what safety looks like could be different for different people. For some people, it might be like, give me space. You probably all know those children who are like, don't talk to me, get away from me, when they get agitated. That is them very clearly telling you that they need safety. I need space. But for kids who are maybe in their emotional brain or are experiencing a different type of safety threat, they might need someone to come closer. They might be those kids that need a hug. Think about little kids who, when something scary is happening, they run to their caregiver and kind of hide behind their legs. So recognize that different individuals will have different needs based on what brain state they're in. And that helps us know how we can help them in that moment. And this is important to think about when, especially we're trying to redirect or do discipline well, is we can't do good discipline until we're talking to someone when they're in their executive functioning brain. It's going to be the only time they can understand it. So we have to address their safety needs and their connection needs before we can help them learn. And we often say that all behavior is communication. That is a saying in our office, and I know in a lot of schools have adopted that as well, that when we see acting out behaviors or attention-seeking behaviors, what we're really seeing is that child is communicating a lack of safety or a lack of connection. Some people don't like attention-seeking behaviors. I love it because that is a child very clearly telling us what they need. I need connection. So when I see gossiping, tattling, bragging, kind of the unsavory sort of attention-seeking things that we don't normally like to see in other individuals, to me, that is screaming out for, I need connection. And that lets me know how I can help. And so really, when we talk about the idea of being trauma-informed and trauma-informed care, the definition, the kind of working definition that we use at Region 10 is keeping people safe and connected so they can learn. And we often use, if people are familiar with Dan Siegel, he uses a hand model of the brain. And this is a great way to explain it to other people. That down here is that survival brain, that brain stem, your big emotions. And then here is your executive functioning brain, and good decisions happen up here. And when someone gets escalated, if they get agitated, if they get triggered in some way, they might flip their lid. And it's our job to help them bring that executive functioning brain back online so that they can make good decisions again and learn from the situation. When you're talking about this with kids, sometimes we simplify it with big emotions, good decisions, or we'll use other metaphors like, this is your barking dog. Like when a mailman comes to the door, your dog might start barking, and up here is your wise old owl. And what happens when your dog starts barking? Your owl flies away. What do we do to bring the owl back? Kids really benefit from hearing that language, and they will use it. And it's powerful for them to be able to understand their brain that way. So in general, it's really important to understand in trauma, there are 3 E's. There's the actual event that has occurred. And so right now, the event that is occurring is a pandemic, which has led to stay-at-home order and online learning. And for some children, they experience that as traumatic. But I think the really important thing to note is this second E, the individual experience of that event can be very, very different. For those of you who taught all online in the spring, you will probably recognize that there are some kids who did better than others. For some kids, they may have the resilience and the skills that they need to power through and really benefit from online learning and feel safe and connected within their home, within their community, despite the current situation. But for other kids, this is a huge struggle. So although we may all be experiencing the same event, we are not having the same personal experience of that event. We often use an example of, if you have 2 kids, maybe twins, in a home where there's domestic violence, although they could be same DNA, they could experience that event very differently. And part of that might be how they process and respond to that event. If there's a domestic violence incident happening and one child runs upstairs and hides, but can still hear the violence that's occurring, that can be deeply traumatic on the body. Whereas the other child maybe runs out the door and goes down to a neighbor's house and experiences some safety and connection in another place. That can be really beneficial for them to get out of that space. Our bodies are really only designed to hold all of those stress hormones that happen when you go into fight, flight, or freeze for about 20 minutes at a time. I think historically, biologically, the idea is it's supposed to take about 20 minutes for you to fight off a bear, run from a bear, or hide and hope the bear goes away. But in our world today, we might not be fighting bears. We might be fighting unsafe community situations. We might be fighting an abusive caregiver. So all of this is just things to keep in mind, that experience is really key. And then the effect that it has. Does their experience then cause them to withdraw, to experience mental health symptoms, to see a heightened level of hypervigilance? These are the things that we want to keep in mind when we talk about trauma. It's not as simple as what was the event. And I'm not going to go into this because this is an entire day-long training, but when we talk about trauma, many school staff are familiar with the idea of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. I just want to say that we've really expanded that view, and we're looking much beyond the original 10 ACEs identified in the ACE study that happened in the 1990s. To really be looking at adverse childhood environments and epigenetics, what's passed down through our genes, and even adverse circuitry experiences for people who are neurodiverse. There's lots of different ways to look at trauma. So another important thing to note is that we all have those times where we get extremely stressed and we flip our lid. We reach our breaking point where we experience maybe a little bit of an emotional outburst, a meltdown, whatever that might look like for us. We reach our breaking point. But there's an idea that we all have a baseline level of stress. So often I use the example of a glass of water. We want to keep our baseline level of stress as low as we can in this glass so that we can take a little bit of water being poured in time and time again, so it doesn't overflow easily. We don't reach that breaking point easily. Because the reality is we're never going to be able to avoid stressors. We are not able to avoid this pandemic. Some people might be kind of covering their ears, closing their eyes, and pretending it's not happening and going about life as usual. But we know that that's not really the case. We cannot avoid all stressors in life. What we can do is lower our baseline level of stress so we're not close to our breaking point. And I think what we have to come to expect is in the fall, kids coming back either into a building or signing on to online learning, whatever it might look like, may have a little more water in their glass than usual. You probably already have students that you've worked with where it only takes a very little bit to have them flip their lid, to set them off. And you're like, that wasn't even a big deal. I can't believe they responded that way. It's not really the event that just occurred. It's that accumulation of stress that they were already so close to their breaking point. So what this might actually look like with our students, it's a little bit different based on the age. For our younger kids, this might be temper tantrums, toileting problems, decreased appetite, fearful of getting sick or their loved ones getting sick, not really understanding what that might mean. And you might see them being a little extra clingy and being fearful of being alone. We might see some more separation anxiety there. In elementary school, we certainly start to see those concentration problems, irritability. We might see some acting out, attention-seeking behaviors, which again is telling us that they need connection. And I would say even with our youngest kids, our pre-K kids, and maybe even younger than that, they are looking for the safe adults in their life to see how they should be reacting to this situation. They are trying to gauge how scared or stressed they should be based on how scared and stressed their caregiver is. So when we are in a school, we are kind of acting as parents in that moment, and we have to model the calm that they need to see in order to modulate their own stress reactions. And in middle and high school, we certainly see disrupted sleep. And I mean, that is already a common thing in middle and high school. Both sleeping too much and sleeping too little, both can have significant problems and impacts on mental health and ability to concentrate. But I think what we will certainly see is for kids who maybe in the springtime we're staying up almost all night and then sleeping in till easily past noon, maybe even past 2 or 3 o'clock during the day, and then just catching up on work later because it was all online based on whatever their learning plan was. It's going to be really hard for them to adjust back if there's an expectation to be in the building at 9 a.m., right? So having some expectations of this start of the school year is going to be rough for a lot of people. We also might see some withdrawal, which is really important to look for in teenagers because we are certainly worried about things like suicide risk. And we know that the most powerful thing that we can do is increase connections with students who are feeling disconnected and are withdrawing from their peers or their other positive supports. You might see some apathy, and substance use is a concern. I think going into the pandemic, even in the mental health substance use field, there was some feelings of, what will this do for youth substance use? Will it make it more difficult for them to access substances? Like, could this be a good thing that it'll be harder for them to get the substances to abuse? And the answer is no. They are still able to access pretty much anything and are using substances as negative coping mechanisms. And so we really want to be mindful of that and help get them connected to the help they may need to build up positive coping mechanisms instead. So if we know all of this, what are we going to do? If we know that we're going to have students coming in with a high baseline level of stress, what can we do to help them? What are the specific strategies? And I really love, as a prevention specialist, the idea of what's predictable is preventable. If we know this is what we're going to be facing in the fall, there are things that we can be doing now and learning now to ease this transition. That's why I'm so glad everyone's here today to hear some of the strategies that I've heard of in trainings. And what we really want to plan for is, how do we provide that safety and connection for our students, whether we're in person in a classroom 5 days a week, 2 days a week, or 0 days a week, and this is all online. How can we best provide safety and connection? And we know the research time and time again tells us that the #1 recommendation for healing trauma is lots and lots of positive, safe relationships. It doesn't have to be with a caregiver. It can be with any school staff, any community staff. The more relationships, the better someone's kind of resilience is, because when we have people around us who are modeling positive coping mechanisms, good co-regulation and self-regulation skills, that helps us learn. So the more young people have safe adults who are modeling those behaviors, the better they will do. So this year, your focus might be primarily on building relationships and building connection with your students. So what does that look like? So we use a lot of our information, comes from the Community Resilience Initiative. And this is an organization based out of Walla Walla, Washington. And if people are familiar with the movie Paper Tigers, which follows Lincoln High School, which is a school that noticed high levels of trauma in the students in their buildings and really made an effort towards becoming trauma informed. And the movie Paper Tigers chronicles that. These are kind of the trainings that go along with becoming trauma informed. And some of what I'm going to share right now is from the Course 2 Trauma Supportive certification. And it's really powerful information. But this is something that schools are so good at because a lot of them are already doing. The idea of creating a family, the CRI will talk about family, not just as your family of origin, but any kind of healthy functioning membership, regardless of size or purpose. This could be a sports team, what school you went to. I mean, certainly in Charlottesville, there's a lot of UVA pride. I actually went to tech undergrad, so I'm very conflicted. My family is very conflicted internally, but it's really any membership group. It could be Bible study, or just a group of friends that meet regularly. I have a trivia team that I meet with regularly when it's not pandemic times, and I consider that one of my families. And what's important is when families meet an individual's basic needs, that individual become increasingly committed to those families' norms and values and goals. And we see that perfectly play out in schools. We see schools build a community of, let's say, like in Charlottesville, one of our elementary schools, Jackson Via, I think they're the Jackrabbits. Like, we are the Jackrabbits. These are the things that we do at our school. Come join, be a part of our community. And when people feel connected then to that school, that community, then there's better adherence to maybe the school's rules and expectations and shared goals. And really, schools already do that very well. Organizations, less so. So if we have people who are signing on not from a school district, this is something to think about in your organization. How do you create a family environment? So in this trauma supportive course, we have this model uses the acronym CAREER. Leslie, do you want to interrupt?
Yes, I was just going to say we had a question come in on that last slide. So I just wanted to read that out loud. I have heard recently that there is a concern about the idea of schools creating families and the stress that is created from that. Could the presenter talk about that as well?
Yeah. So, I've heard in giving this presentation over the last few years, there are some people who are deeply uncomfortable with even the term family based on maybe their experiences from their family of origin. So sometimes it's like the concept itself that can be kind of troubling. But one of the other ways that we hear kind of criticism about this idea, it is kind of particular to anti-bullying programs. And some of the language that is used within there. And I know from reviewing anti-bullying programs over the past few years, looking through my trauma-informed lens, it is hard when we think about some of the language that is taught of like, at our school, we don't do that here. What we're doing is pushing people away with that kind of language when what we need to be doing is pulling them in and building that connection, right? We know that when we see children exhibiting bullying behaviors, that is their brain predicting threat, and they are acting from their survival or emotional brain. And what they need is also safety and connection. And often the ways that even our evidence-based bullying prevention programs address that sort of makes them feel separated and othered. And so I do think you have to be really intentional with how you use the term family and what that actually means, what the expectations of the family actually are. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But I do want to validate there are concerns with the idea of when we create a family, what about people who then get kicked out of the family? What if someone's suspended or expelled? How does that make them feel? It can lead down a troubling road, because from our research, that's where we start to see the development of antisocial behaviors and aggressive behaviors, and potentially things like school shootings, right? It's when we've really othered people. We want to bring them in close. And I see the other question here about when educators not move towards an anti-racist belief system and the family concept increases trauma. This actually, I'll talk. This course is the trauma supportive course is a full day long normally, and the trauma informed course, which is course 1, is also a full day long. And we talk a lot more in there about how racism is an ACE. It is an adverse childhood experience or adverse cultural experience is actually the language that the CRI uses, that can have a devastating impact on someone's mental health and their health outcomes. And right now in our society, it is necessary to be talking about how race is layered with trauma-informed care. So I do think it's a big undertaking to train a school district in becoming anti-racist, but I do feel like there are some districts that are doing that and doing that well. I know even at UVA, they have a wonderful Professor Joseph Williams in the Counselor Education Program who did some sessions with the Charlottesville City Schools this year that were wonderful. And he just did a presentation with the State Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services, and having local experts like that who can really speak to how important it is to look through an anti-racist lens when reviewing things like a trauma-informed school policy is just vital. All right, I'm gonna keep moving on unless Leslie stops me again. Okay, so the first part of this model is, and the way I'm going to present this is really sharing the science and then sharing the specific strategies. So there'll be kind of 2 slides for each step. But the first one, it seems sort of silly and fun, but it is actually very important, and it means more than just a party. So the idea of celebrations being organizers of family life that can provide stability during times of stress and transition. During non-COVID times, we would talk about this in terms of maybe a child whose parents are getting separated or divorced and how turbulent that could be for them. How important it is to have some structure around the celebrations that they would normally have in their life. What does a birthday look like for them? What does a summer vacation look like for them? How is it different? How is it the same? And really trying to keep as much consistency as you can. And there is such good research that we delve much more into in detail in course 2 that talks about when we are intentional about celebrating the very small things in daily life, it makes our life much more meaningful. And so I'm going to talk about what exactly celebrations means, because again, it is not just a party. So the way that the CRI describes celebrations is much broader. There's the idea of when someone passes away, they are delivered their last rites. And what the CRI says is, why aren't we doing first rites? Why aren't we starting with telling people what we appreciate about them and how important they are to us right from the beginning? And so I'm going to share a few of the examples that they use. The aloha rites. Aloha, if you're familiar, can mean hello and goodbye. But what it really also captures is saying that you are honored by the presence of the other person. And when we are intentional about welcoming people into our space, it can make a huge difference. The difference between someone saying, good morning, Leslie, good morning, Kimberly, using people's names can be incredibly impactful. When I worked at Charlottesville High School for a few years, and for a while I shared a wall with an English teacher who would start every single class with welcome, welcome, and every day that was to be expected. And the one day she didn't do it, her students were like, hey, what's wrong? What happened? Because they were so used to, this is part of our routine. This is how we get greeted every day. It's showing that she is ready for class, and the expectation is then that we are ready for class. But it's really important to just acknowledge people as they enter your space. And what that looks like on Zoom could be incredibly different than what it looks like in a classroom. I think teachers are generally pretty good at welcoming students into their class. We've all seen those videos of teachers who learn the handshakes with every individual student as they walk in the door. That's a lot of work, and mad props to the teachers who can pull that off. But even just acknowledging each student as they enter your room can be really powerful. Over Zoom, you might have to be creative in thinking of ways, how do I check in with each person as they sign on? What does that look like? Is it even just typing it in the chat? What happens? Achievement rights is something that schools are maybe a little more familiar with. It's how do we celebrate those big achievements, like things like graduation. I loved seeing this year sort of the drive-by celebrations that teachers were doing out in the community, the drive-by graduations that happened at our local schools, trying to maintain some normalcy. That is exactly the science of celebration that we like to see from our school districts, is what can we do to show that we are still honoring this achievement? And do we need to adjust what we imagine achievement to be. If normally it's, passing your SOLs or whatever kind of high academic achievement it might be, is it you made it to class every day this week? That is amazing. I saw you logged on every single day. I'm really proud of you. Being intentional in recognizing that. The missed you rights, I think, are going to be really important this year. This is when someone is gone from our space for whatever reason. How do we let them know that we miss them when they weren't there? And our classroom family wasn't the same without them. People need a sense of belonging, and knowing that you are missed when you are gone is an incredible important part of that. So I think about students who are out sick or maybe, quarantined, whatever the situation might be. Maybe they have to attend a family funeral or something related to COVID or not, and they miss some days of class. When they come back, being able to say, hey, I really miss you. I'm so glad you're back with us today. During a typical school year, we might say, I know there are always some students who seem to be absent on the day of tests or when big projects are due. And when they come to school the next day or the day after that, instead of immediately starting with, you missed the test, when are we going to make that up? Which is important. You can start with, I really missed you. I'm so glad you're back in the building today. We have so much to talk about, and really making sure that they know that they are important, not just the fact that they missed the test, right? And then coming and going rights is really how someone joins our family or leaves our family. So this might look like at the beginning of the year or the end of the year. How do we build a community together? Especially if we end up starting online, what might that look like? How do we build a sense of community when everyone is on a screen? It can be really challenging. And how do we say goodbye? I read friends with many teachers on social media, and a lot of people were sharing their pain over the end of the year. They tried to have like a goodbye Zoom, and very few students logged on, and how that's sort of heartbreaking. And I think it's okay to recognize as teachers, that is heartbreaking. You put in a lot of work with those students all year long, and you really care about them. And you wanted a chance to say goodbye, and for it not to happen in the way that it might have in a classroom is painful. So really thinking about and planning for that can be really powerful. And what we found is that students really like being a part of the planning for those things. So if you get students involved with like, okay, how are we going to celebrate the end of the year? That can be powerful. So when thinking about at the beginning of the year, how you're going to welcome people back in, it might be reaching out before school starts to let them know, I am so excited to have you with me, whether that's in person or online. I can't wait to get to know you. And then I heard recently the idea of a graduation speech at the beginning of the year, doing kind of a creative writing or exercise. This can be adapted for any age, of what would you want to be able to say about yourself at the end of the year? Do you want to be able to say, I am really proud of myself because this year I was flexible and I did all the work I was supposed to do, and I tried my hardest, even though learning on a screen is hard for me, and sort of write the speech that they would want to be able to give themselves at the end of the year. And it can give them something to think about. And I just thought that was a really sweet idea. Okay, the next kind of station that we'll talk about is expectations. This one is going to be very important because I think it will be constantly changing. We want to have clearly communicated expectations. How many of us like being in situations where expectations are unclear? I think about starting a new job and how painful it is. If you're not sure exactly what your duties are, and it's like, I don't want to do anything wrong, but if you don't have clear expectations, it can cause a lot of internal anxiety. And the thing that goes with expectations is clear monitoring and positive or negative consequences. And we often use the idea of maybe a four-way stop. Some people, maybe late at night when not many other cars are around, when you roll up to a four-way stop, you might tap your brakes and then turn right or go straight when you see no one else is there. But not everyone is necessarily coming to the full stop that they should. However, If you see a police officer at one of the other ways of this 4-way stop, you probably are fully stopping on those brakes, using your turn signal, waiting maybe 5 seconds, and then turning. When you have that monitoring, you are much more likely to meet those expectations because you know that there could be consequences if you don't do that. So I think the same is going to go for students in the classroom. What are the monitoring and consequences that need to happen for things like completing schoolwork? Being really clear of what that will be starting off the year is very important. And part of that, when we think about those specific strategies, it is having those clearly stated. So I wanted to focus on one, the safety plan. So certainly if you're going to be in person, you want to make sure that the kids hear over and over again, what are the expectations in the school and in your classroom? Maybe you're going to have slightly stricter expectations in your classroom. It could be dependent on the school and what's allowed, but what does social distancing look like? What does mask wearing look like? What does hand washing look like? The science shows it's really powerful to have a visual expectation to go along with all of these different rules that you might have. I think particularly we think about that with younger kids. Let's show how to wash our hands. Maybe put up something like the preamble or whatever that they could read while they're washing their hands. They do it for enough time, things like that. And do a little bit of show and tell, demonstrate for them what you need. Hey, I put these, arrows in on the ground in the classroom to show which ways we should be walking around to make sure we're not running into each other a lot, whatever it might be. Demonstrate what you want them to learn. And then the other expectation that I think we're going to have to be really clear about is online learning, because we know that is going to vary school to school. It might look different teacher to teacher, and it might look very different than spring. So they may have fully adjusted to what online learning looked like in the spring, but now in the fall, there might be different expectations. So you want to clarify those expectations as best you can on day one. And it is perfectly okay for teachers to acknowledge, I don't have all the answers either. And so we might do an update to this. We might check in 2 weeks and see if things are going well. And maybe we need to adjust some of those expectations. And that's okay. Some of those online learning expectations that you really want to focus on is certainly the time. If you're doing synchronous or asynchronous learning, do they have to log in at a certain time? What happens if they don't? How do they take breaks? If they need to get up and go to the bathroom, what does that look like? Do they have to put that in the chat? They need a glass of water. You do want to encourage them to take care of their basic needs the way that you would in a classroom. You also want to plan for technology failures. I know we see this a lot in the counseling field, that at the beginning of our calls, we have to say, okay, if you get disconnected, I'm going to try to call you back because for therapy, it's because we're worried like that something might be going on. But for school, you might need to come up with kind of a contingency plan of what happens when technology fails, which we know it does, especially if everyone is working from home and everyone is on the Wi-Fi at the same time. And then how do we ask questions? We can tell even from this training, it can be hard to ask a question in a Zoom setting versus if you were in a classroom and you could raise your hand and the teacher could come over and talk individually. So thinking about what that looks like. And it's just important that you might have to continually, what we call remind and rewind, if someone pops off the call without saying goodbye. So then we're concerned, saying, hey, I'm calling to let you know, remember next time, let us know and let's try again. And having a grace period. There's going to be a learning adjustment for this. Affirmations, I won't spend a lot of time on because this is something that people tend to know, but we want affirmations to be present, personal, and positive. And we know, especially during COVID, when things can seem so bleak and dire, it's the power of positive thinking is crucial, especially when we don't know what to expect. There's a professor at UVA, my colleague did a guest lecture in one of her classes who she loved, that she started her Zoom session with asking students, what are some affirmations that you need? And these were some of the affirmations here on the right that her students came up with. And I think they're great, that during this time, we need to tell ourselves these things. We need to give people shout outs when they're doing well and think about what our mantra is and our community mantra. I've heard a lot of we're all in this together. I think those messages can be really powerful for building a sense of community. Education, I'm also not going to preach on education to a bunch of educators, but what I'll say is teaching people about the brain and the brain science is incredibly powerful. I think people are often scared to do that because they think it might be scary in some way or shaming for people who have experienced trauma, but that is not what the research indicates. People want to know this information because when we know better, we can do better. And how powerful to know this isn't my fault. This is the way my brain is wired and there's something I can do about it. That really instills a sense of optimism. So we find, again, I said this earlier, teaching children the hand model can be really powerful because that way maybe someone logs on to the Zoom session and is like, today, this is how I feel. That's all they need to tell you. If like they are not feeling safe and connected and they're not in the right headspace to learn. So I need to take a second and say, what can I do? Man, you seem very overwhelmed. What would help right now? And really try to address those needs. And we want to normalize those experiences that everyone is experiencing some stress right now. And it's okay to share, oh, you know what? I woke up today and today was really hard too for me. So let's try to get through this together and lean on one another when we need it. I think that's a great way to build a relationship, which we want between teachers and students. The next kind of station that we'll cover is regulation. And this one's really important for remaining calm and aware of our body sensations in these stressful situations. I'll say our autonomic nervous system is the key to calming stress. There's actually two parts of the autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is sort of what gears us up. It has our upregulation hormones. So this can feel really bad in stressful situations. But there are also upregulation moments that feel good. Maybe if you get nervous, if you're one of the people that likes roller coasters or scary movies or even first dates, things like that, that get you a little, those nervous jitters that can feel good, that is also your sympathetic nervous system. What we have to practice and build is our parasympathetic nervous system, which does our down regulation and our calming. And you have to treat this like a muscle. This is something we have to practice and learn, and we can. But this muscle, this nervous system is going to be incredibly important during this pandemic. So the strategies that we think of here, the physical regulation is clearly important. Hopefully the health and physical education teachers are going to really be creative in incorporating those strategies into the day. But what could you be doing to start your class with a little bit of regulation, whether it's breathing, some sort of grounding exercise, something that centers the person in the room, in their body. And are we taking enough breaks to allow that regulation to happen? But one of the things I want to highlight is when we are incredibly stressed, when we are in our survival or emotional brain, it is really hard to access the self-care strategies that we've learned because we are not communicating with our executive functioning brain where those strategies live. So what we might actually need is co-regulation. We might need someone else to help us, to prompt us. What do we need to do to calm ourselves? And between each other, between educators, it can be really powerful to have a regulation buddy in the building, or if you're at home, someone that you call at the end of the day just to check in or text when you're having a stressful time. I'm sure many of you already have that. I often hear people talk about, my work wife or my work husband or regulation buddy. They use that phrase. It can be so powerful to have that person who can anticipate your needs and know what you need. When I get really dysregulated at work, my regulation buddy knows I need to be left alone for a minute, and then I can get myself some coffee, and then I can come back in and be my best self. Other people might need to process right away, but it's important for you to think about what works for me when I get dysregulated, and does my regulation buddy know that, and can they help prompt me to do that? Because it is really hard. My buddy can say, Emily, you need to take a minute in your office and come back out. And that's powerful. And the idea of resonance is just the feeling of being with another person. And this is difficult when we're doing online learning. Sometimes the example we give here is that feeling you get from a pet, like that feeling you get when you have your hand on a dog's stomach and you're feeling them breathing. it causes a biological reaction that is calming to us. So when you can't be there in person and you can tell that your student is dysregulated, see if they have something like a pet or a stuffed animal or something that brings them some calm at home, that can bring them some resonance. And then I think it's really important this year to just take a minute and think about why you became educators, why you are in this field, and thinking about what your purpose and goal for this year may be. It may be different than previous years, right? It might not be related to academics and teaching a certain skill or a new concept to the best of your ability. It might be, I'm going to do everything I can to connect with my students this year, because instead of kind of reacting to this situation, we're responding to the need, and the need that everyone in this country right now has is for connection and safety. And so how can we as educators provide that? And I want you to think about the teachers that you had in your pre-K through 12 lifetime. You might not remember the specific things they taught you, but you might remember how they made you feel. That is going to be incredibly important this year, because how you make your students feel might be what provides them with safety and connection during this really stressful, traumatic time. So really giving yourself permission to focus on that safety and connection is powerful. So I want to leave time for questions, and we have about 6 or 7 minutes left. But I'll just say, again, these are concepts that are taught over days and days of learning. So if you're interested in drilling down and learning more, either about trauma in the brain or really diving deeper into these strategies of how do we create a safe and connected family, whether that's school family or community family, I've put my information at the end of this slideshow, and you're welcome to reach out, and I can share that certification information. But I want to just remind people about the Q&A option and raising hands.
Yes, thank you, Emily. So this is our Q&A option. We have 2 ways of doing this. You're welcome to type questions directly into the Q&A feature if you prefer. I'm going to lower all hands right now, but you can also raise your hand through it if you'd like to speak directly with Emily. We have an option to unmute you so that you can engage or ask maybe a more detailed question if you have it. All right, so I see Erin has a question. Erin, I am going to allow you to talk directly with Emily, and you can unmute yourself now.
Thank you so much, Emily and Kimberly and everybody there, because this is really so helpful, and it really does lower my stress as a teacher, because it's coming up and it's all craziness. So anyways, my question is, during I can see where, this distance learning can work, and also I can, as a teacher, I can be empathetic and, suggest these things. How do I connect the students? So there's a lot of my students didn't want to get in groups. They wanted just to be with me during that time. They just wanted, sometimes they'd go for 2 other people. And even I tried to get them to just play games with each other, and it was still a little bit hard. I got maybe 3 or 4, so how can I connect them?
That is a really good question. And it certainly will depend on your age group and your classroom setting. And I would, in the time that you have with that student individually, try to figure out why there's hesitation for being in a group setting. Do they not feel comfortable with their peers in class? What's that about? Do they feel like, even with playing a game, I know that I'm a game person, but my sister is not, and she's told me she feels stupid when she plays games, even though it's not academic related at all. And so trying to find ways that they can engage. That actually comes from, there's a model called stress first aid that we, lots of places implement after largely stressful events like this. And one of the strategies talked about there is finding the thing that person is good at and seeing if there's a way to make a project around that would engage them. That would allow them to show some mastery, because that is a huge part of building resilience in kids, is allowing them to feel some mastery over a topic or a thing. And if we can find something that really speaks to them, it can be powerful. And I do think that this will go into having those expectations set at the beginning of the year, because I think switching mid-year, it's hard to get people on board with doing things like Zoom groups. We also struggled with therapy groups of getting people fully on board with that because they're not used to it and it feels awkward. If we know that's what the full year is going to be like, we can say early on, this is the expectation and this is how we're going to do it. This is how we're going to make it fun, and really be intentional about that. But that's a great question.
That's how we do it in a classroom. And I understand what you're saying is like, there wasn't an expectation in March that everybody had to get on Zoom or everybody had to get on Schoology. So now the expectation, well, they will have to do it. And that, that's an expectation. And then, we can do breakout groups just like we do in class, and groups can, some kids can be the oral, presenters. And I understand that's.
I want to acknowledge it's hard though.
But it's good because I just remember just how can you make what you do in the virtual. So I get it. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to speak directly. Otherwise, you can also type your questions in the Q&A box. We're allowing some time. I know formulating questions and typing them out may take a moment, so feel free to use that Q&A box or raise your hand again, like Erin did, if you want to speak directly and share more.
As a counselor, I'm comfortable with silence too, so I'm happy to wait people out. And for people who maybe don't feel comfortable asking their question as part of the group, you can email prevention@region10.org here, and that will come to me. And I might be able to answer your questions individually as well if you have some more follow-up.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions at this point, we are going to, oh, I see a comment from Melissa. Let's see. We do have another question. All right.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and read this out loud to you, Emily. You might see it too. I also think the connecting virtually applies to the equity issues. Some children will be in childcare situations that may not be able to support their online participation.
It absolutely does. And so making things not dependent on technology is a challenge that I think many teachers are going to face this year, because you're right, there are childcare situations that are not conducive to that at all. And if someone is in a chaotic home and people are moving around, let alone if the connection to the internet is good there, if there's a lot happening in the home, child might not feel comfortable coming on Zoom and unmuting themselves and participating in a class, right? So what is the flexibility that the school expectations have for student learning? Because we do have many, many students who that is true for. And what can we do to measure their learning in a way that isn't necessarily over Zoom in that moment? Are there other creative ways? Can they film themselves giving you like talking about a certain topic as a way to measure their learning progress, and send it directly to you, or have a one-on-one conversation with you, like the last person said. It is a challenge. I do think this year we're going to see the huge inequities in our education field, especially for people who do not have caregivers at home who can even read. You know, we have many of those in our community here in Charlottesville-Albemarle, and what that means for getting help on concepts you don't understand. They may need that individual time with their teacher. And I think you have to use the resources that are available to you. When you notice that a child is not engaging in class, I would hope schools are partnering with other local agencies to provide things like tutoring services, one-on-one tutoring services. Like in our area, UVA has Madison House that often provides tutors. Really tapping into those resources, because we need to be quick to refer those children so they don't fall farther behind. And also being quick to refer to your school counselor. If there are some stressors, and especially if we expect that this is a truly chaotic home where there could potentially be some abuse, it is not the expectation that you investigate that. Please refer that to your school counselor, and have them try to reach out to that student and kind of gauge their stress level with what's going on. We have these resources available. Let's try to use them.
Thank you. So we have one last question. Do you recommend folding new students into our communities in a season where there is a less natural mingling and most of our faces will be covered?
Unfortunately, it might be necessary. I don't think it's ideal in any way. I think it is really hard, especially if you think about like a transfer student or someone coming in to a new setting, how disappointing it is for for them to not feel like they even know what their peers or their teacher looks like, with the face coverings and things like that. But it is going to happen. We can't prevent new people from being folded into our community. I mean, I think even locally in Charlottesville, we're going to have an influx of UVA students coming back here shortly. If you're in Harrisonburg, it will be JMU. Even if school goes online, we're going to have people come back to be in the area. We are not going to be able to prevent new people joining the community. But what we can do is think about those like celebration rites when someone is joining our specific family. You can discuss as a group beforehand. If we get a new student, what might that look like? How would we greet them? What would we tell them about ourselves? What do we want to know about them? You know, we do that on a small level in our office. When we hire a new staff member, we ask things like, when's your birthday? Do you like to celebrate your birthday? And if you do, how do you like to celebrate it? What's your favorite sweet treat? That kind of thing. Asking if they like to celebrate it at all is important. But those are the kinds of things that we would want to know about someone joining our family. And it's not ideal, and it's probably going to happen.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. So at this point, we're going to wrap up. This is the first of 4 sessions, professional development sessions. Next week, we'll be talking about student mental health and teacher well-being. So same time next Thursday, 12 p.m. If you're interested, you can visit our website and register if you have not done so yet. And I just want to take a moment and thank you, Emily. This has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for joining us. I've seen a couple of messages thanking you. So thank you for spending this hour with us and teaching us a bit more about trauma-informed teaching practices.
So grateful everyone was able to come in July. I know it's a stressful time, and I really want to say I appreciate what you do, and I know how difficult this year is going to be. And I just feel like the way the media talks about it makes it sound so unsympathetic, and the concerns are very real for teachers, and I just want you to know that your community supports you. So let us know what you need.
Yes, and thank you all for joining us today. We will have the slides uploaded, and a recording of this presentation will be uploaded on our website within the next few days. If you need anything, please email us at Youth-Nex, youth-nex@virginia.edu. Thank you.